Okay, so this is kind of keeping along with like what we call our paleo themes, right? So paleo futures. This is H.G. Wells's 1933 book. It's called Predictions in the Shape of Things to Come. It was a really, I mean, H.G. Wells, right? So it was science fiction, but also predictive. So he talked about things in this book like in 1940, because he wrote this in 1933, and he said in 1940 we were going to have a 30-year war. It was going to be actually happening, I think, in Danzig, right? So, in the same area that
Pretty
in World War
good.
II happened. He predicted aerial warfare, right? So that planes destroying whole cities, which had not happened up until that point in the world, which and then obviously did happen in World War II. He talked about dictatorships. He thought that after we have this big giant war, we're going to have this benevolent dictatorships and a technocratic rebirth that's going to happen. When they said that these skilled pilots were going to be the ones and engineers were going to be the ones to like become these autocratic or dictatorial leaders, he talked about kind of a utopian development and social engineering. And he talked about globalism, right? He said that we would become a globalist society where we would abolish national divisions. English would become the preferred language of the world, and religion would be outlawed. So he had some very intense predictions that he thought that would happen. What's interesting though is, as we always look at when we look at older books, Paleo Futures, we look at what he actually got right. And some of the things he got right was obviously English is a language that is used really as a global language now. And that partly came out of World War II, the dominance of the United States. And, he talked about things there would be a loss of cultural diversity and pluralism. And, he said by being unified and eliminating religion, we would be a better society. And obviously, we might have some religious listeners listening to this, and they would go, "Well, of course not." But it's something to say, even if you are religious, to think about this as what if we didn't have another thing that divided us by our beliefs? I'm a firm believer you just keep your beliefs private, right? You shouldn't just tell everyone your beliefs, and it should be you believe what you believe, and that's great. But the idea of having no religion or religious practices is something that's actually a common theme in a lot of science fiction novels. So I actually just reread Ender's Game recently. And in Ender's Game, in the first book, they talk about how they are outlawed religious practices in order to kind of build this war economy and make sure everybody's on the same level. And they have this unified world government that comes out. So like it's really interesting that this is a theme that constantly comes up again and again in science fiction. So, Chris, this is a question I have for you. I know you've read the book. I know you might have seen the movie and the film that came out shortly thereafter. What is your perspectives on H.G. Wells's predictions?
Well, a couple things. As you noted, he got some things right. He got some things wrong. I think that what's interesting is this came out in 1933. Of course, 1933 was the year of the Reichstag fire. It was the year of the beginning of the Nazi regime. There was a lot. It was in the middle of the Great Depression. Really FDR's New Deal hadn't kickstarted. I mean, things looked exactly how he was painting it. And you know, when you're a futurist and you're looking at the future of things, you're going to sort of look at the trends that are in front of you, and you're going to try to predict like where things are going to go. Air power was becoming more supreme. The old guard was going down. Emergencies were probably going to come when you have like old power. So frankly, I think he just read the world in front of him and adroitly noted some of the issues that would come to pass. I think there's some things that he maybe didn't get right, or maybe it aged poorly. I mean, he does talk a lot about eugenics in the book, fate in these technocracies, a sort of a thing. And I think he really underestimated, kind of similar to what you were talking about in terms of this religious aspect, which is how culture and religions and ideology, the power of ideas actually will force and or not force change in societies because of old beliefs, because of a connected, affiliation to a nation, to a group, to an economic ideal or capability. So, I think there's obviously some holes in what he's looking at, but frankly, when you're talking about good futures work and taking what you see in front of you and extrapolating on where it's going to go, a really bang up job. So, frankly, it's a fascinating read. The fact that it's almost 100 years old just shows us that futures and futures thinking has always sort of been a part of us. And of course, G. Wells, we talked about him before on the podcast. He's frankly just one of the best futurists of all time.
Absolutely. And what's unique about this, and especially this book is specifically, is that it is combining science. It is defining a future defined by science, elite control, right? Instilling this this techno elite and engineered humans. And engineered humans comes up a lot over the past 100 plus years. It seems we're kind of obsessed with eugenics and with race and the conflict of cultures. It seems to be it's a very prominent theme, and even today it's very poignant, right? We're talking about, I mean, I try not to get on X anymore because X is very, all social media is bad. We talk about this, right? It's just it's all one sided one way or the other. But like, it's all about like the Muslim invasion of the West, and it's everywhere I look as people are talking about it, decrying this and saying this is the end of the world. Obviously, we just had a horrible terror attack in Australia, right? When we're recording this, that the Bondi Beach, right? But like, and so that is something that people are not obsessing over, but it is very prominent in our society now, where people are talking about these cultural clashes. And he talked about it, right? And he said, well, the way that it's going to be eliminated and Islam's going to go away. He said, he's like, we're going to outlaw religion and ideology. There's a reason why these religions are hundreds and even thousands of years old, is because it's very difficult to convince people or to, sway someone if they have this religious belief that maybe came from birth. They've been raised with this belief. It is very utopian in his view, in one of his views, this elimination of religion, and this cultural unity versus this pluralism that we have today and we had back in 1933 as well. And I think he also talked about some other things that he got right was the fragility of human populations, right, or of civilian populations and what could happen with the civilian populations. We then saw that very short few years later, the devastation that was wrought on civilian populations from aerial bombardment and other things like that. And the idea of the war economy. And, you're seeing that right now in conflicts around the world still, right? With Ukraine and Russia, right? The civilians are getting killed, or at least on one side. And so I think also this idea, and you talk to globalists, right? And globalists will say, well, the nation state should go away. We're all global citizens, and that sounds great, but that's not really possible in today's society. Maybe in 20 or 30 years. And he didn't mention really the artificial intelligence side of things, but maybe when AI is in robotics get to a point where it's taking over all of the jobs and we have to have some sort of thing, but then we're all equal, right? Because we're all not working. So then that's something where that tech driven governance kind of hints at. And so those are some things that I thought were really interesting themes that he came up with. Other things that this tech driven, this science driven, this rational thought driven society, is that something that you see could occur, or do you think that that's just really utopian in his beliefs, and we will never have a society like that because we'll always have these religious beliefs and other things.
So, I mean, there's a couple things. One, I think people discount how important the idea of religion, myths, how powerful these stories are to give human beings a central story to, sort of drive your life around. There's some of these ideas that he talks about, right, when it comes to the end of these nation states, but the one world government and one world connection. And you have to create an ideal. One thing I've explored this year, I read The Lord of the Rings again. Tolkien's idea to create The Lord of the Rings was Finland actually had just went through all of their old stories. And before they became a country, they actually took all of their fables and their myths and they put it into like one big, essentially Finnish, like this is the story of Finland. And they were able to create a country based on the story of who they are. And, you know, Yuval Noah Harari talks about this a lot too. Right? The reason why human beings were able to kill Neanderthals or take over the world and create this civilization that we call, the Earth, is that we create stories. We create stories and say that gold is worth a certain amount and that a dollar and digital currency is worth something. Say this flag or this particular thing counts more than maybe other certain jobs or certain types of clothing or certain type of technology, or sometimes even frankly what people look like is worth certain money versus others. It's deemed positive or negative, and it's all created in systems. And I think what H.G. Wells really misses is that he puts a lot of faith in reason. He puts a lot of faith in elite capabilities and the technical sort of aspects of a society. And as we were just talking about with Yuval Noah Harari, he actually doesn't put much faith not only into reason, because we're kind of being very unreasonable right now, but elites don't seem to be leading us because they're the ones actually directing some of this technological capabilities. So he's very sort of skeptical, when it comes to the implementation of a fantastic, well-run, one world government, all under one sort of flag, directing for the peace and stability of mankind. The tones are much different. H.G. Wells is talking about the need to sort of get past all this chaos so we can actually get to the, like you said, utopian future. And I think, when we look at Yuval Noah Harari's work, as we were just talking about in Nexus, very cautionary, very sort of like what could happen if we don't do this properly. Frankly, the fact that they're almost 100 years apart, it just makes sense because both are looking at the present to imagine what the future could be. I think that's what makes both books particularly compelling. I also do think, though, too, that H.G. Wells's view, the way he has always sort of was able to look at the present and imagine what the future could be, is a very helpful framing device for a futurist, for people who are looking deeply at things. You have to kind of throw an idea out there. You have to be willing to do. That's a big part of future studies to me, and people who are doing great futures work, is you can't just say what is happening right in front of you, right, and be a trend person. You actually have to start to wrestle with the potential for these future ideas, and maybe perhaps get some stuff wrong along the way, but you're creating a vision for the future. You're creating something particularly interesting, a new vision for what things could be. And I think it makes for a richer way to not only imagine the future, but to create it as well.
It's interesting you bring up Harari, right? So, H.G. Wells, right, born over 150 years ago. And in 1919, so yeah, roughly 100 years ago, he wrote what some people call like the first transnational history of the human race, right? Which
Mm,
Harari writes
interesting.
similar things, right? He wrote so he wrote the outline of history. That's what H.G. Wells wrote, and it talked about early our history and from even our earliest evolution, right? So very similar to Harari. And his predictions, right? H.G. Wells, who we've talked about a lot, so we won't rehash all of those predictions, but he predicted things like satellites. He predicted space travel. He predicted submarines. He predicted tanks. He predicted, the atomic bomb,
Mm,
satellite television, not just satellites, the satellite television, the World Wide Web. Like all of these things are things he wrote about in his science fiction novels. And the idea of not only just this one series, right, where he talks about things, and he was written as science fiction, but he has a very utopian view. He actually, even though he wrote some very dark things, right, like bombs and 30 Years Wars, right, he always seemed to have like a utopian view of he thinks that technology will help us get out of those things, right, and even if we do have genetic editing, right, it will be used for good and will create super people who will be able to be enlightened. And that's what he talked about in this book, the enlightenment of people in a pursuit of knowledge. And I think that those are things that are very worthwhile to pursue. And even though he was wrong in some of his predictions, the fact that some of these we still haven't solved today, over almost 100 years later, we're still talking about these things, cultural clashes, societal clashes, which have obviously exist for hundreds and thousands of years, but also the idea of, genetic editing and how technology will influence our decision making going forward. It's really those are things that, I mean, in the 30s, we we had only had automobiles for a couple of decades, right? So, like, the ideas that he was expressing, I think, obviously just way ahead of his time. And the idea of human rights and all of these things and the abolition of religion, right? Like that is, even today, it just seems ludicrous. I think he's just, this is a very good book. I would suggest people to read it. There's a film that came out a couple of years later after he wrote it. It's okay. It was filmed in the 30s, right? So, but it's definitely something that I recommend people to read and to just pick up any H.G. Wells novels, and you'll just have a great time. So I think this is just one of those.